Hey guys, tonight the journey leads into the kitchens, dining rooms and streets of ancient Rome, where food was far more than mere sustenance. From the simple gruel of the urban poor to the elaborate feasts of emperors, from the smoky taverns lining narrow streets to the perfumed triclinia where the elite reclined, Roman eating culture reveals a civilization of startling sophistication and equally startling extremes. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here, and let everyone know, in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds imagine ancient Rome, certain images tend to surface. Marble columns rising toward Mediterranean skies, gladiators in sand-filled arenas, senators in togas debating matters of state. These visions carry truth, certainly, but they miss something fundamental about Roman life. The centrality of food not just to survival, but to social identity, political manoeuvring, and the expression of cultural values. The Romans were obsessed with food in ways both familiar and deeply strange to contemporary understanding. They wrote cookbooks that have survived millennia, detailing recipes that range from recognizable to bizarre. They constructed elaborate dining rooms designed specifically for reclining while eating. They created a complex vocabulary around food and dining that reveals how deeply embedded eating was in their social consciousness. This wasn't a civilization content with mere nourishment. The Romans transformed eating into performance art, social ritual, political tool, and philosophical concern. What a person ate, how they ate it, where they dined, and with whom they shared meals. All these details communicated social status, cultural sophistication, and personal values with a clarity that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. The Roman relationship with food evolved considerably across the centuries. The stern farmers of the early Republic, living on simple porridge and vegetables, would have been horrified by the elaborate banquets of the late Empire. The transformation from agricultural simplicity to decadent luxury troubled Roman moralists, who saw in changing dining habits the corruption of traditional values. Yet food remained constant in its importance, even as specific practices changed. From the founding of Rome in the 8th century BCE through the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century CE, eating structured daily life, marked social boundaries, and provided endless topics for discussion, debate, and literary exploration. Understanding Roman food culture requires looking beyond the famous banquets that dominate popular imagination. While those elaborate feasts occurred and were culturally significant, they represented only a tiny fraction of Roman dining experience. Most Romans ate far more modestly, their meals shaped by economic limitations, seasonal availability, and practical constraints. The geography of the Roman Empire profoundly influenced what people ate. The Mediterranean climate, with its hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, favoured certain crops while making others impractical. Wheat, barley, olives and grapes thrived in these conditions and became staples of Roman diet. The sea provided fish and shellfish. The surrounding countryside offered vegetables, fruits and limited meat. As Rome expanded from a city-state to an empire spanning 3 continents, its food culture became increasingly complex. Trade routes brought exotic ingredients from Africa, Asia and distant European provinces. Spices from India, dates from North Africa, oysters from Britain, all these appeared on Roman tables, at least for those wealthy enough to afford them. This global trade network created a paradox in Roman food culture. The empire's vast extent made Rome itself perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world, with ingredients and cooking techniques from dozens of cultures available in its markets. Yet this same diversity remained concentrated primarily in urban centres and among the wealthy, while rural populations continued eating much as their ancestors had for generations. The social dimension of Roman dining cannot be overstated. Meals were not private affairs, but carefully orchestrated social events, where hierarchies were displayed, alliances forged, and reputations made or destroyed. Who reclined where at a banquet, what dishes were served to which guests, how the host managed the flow of conversation and entertainment, all these mattered intensely in a society where social status was everything. Food also carried moral weight in Roman thought. Philosophers and moralists constantly discussed proper eating habits. They debated whether luxury corrupted virtue, whether simple food indicated moral strength, whether dining habits revealed character. These weren't idle discussions, but reflected genuine anxiety about what eating meant and what it revealed about individuals and society. Religion intertwined with eating in complex ways. The Romans made food offerings to their gods, pouring libations of wine and burning portions of meals as sacrifices. Certain foods were associated with specific deities or religious festivals. Dietary restrictions existed for priests and during certain ritual periods. The boundaries between sacred and profane in eating were more porous than modern secular societies might recognise. Tonight's exploration begins with the basic structure of Roman meals and moves through the social hierarchies of dining, the actual foods consumed across different classes, the preparation methods that transformed raw ingredients into finished dishes, and the customs and rituals that surrounded eating. The journey encounters street food vendors and imperial banquets, simple porridge and exotic delicacies, practical nutrition and outrageous luxury. This isn't just a story about what Romans ate, though that's fascinating enough. It's an exploration of how a civilization understood itself through food, how eating became a language for expressing everything from political power to philosophical virtue, from social aspiration to cultural identity. The Roman table was a stage where all of Roman life played out, so settle in, perhaps with appreciation for the convenience and variety of modern food systems, and prepare to discover what eating truly meant in ancient Rome. The meals that sustained an empire, the feasts that scandalized moralists, the humble daily bread that fed millions, all await exploration. The journey begins not with exotic banquets, but with the basic rhythms of daily eating that structured Roman life from dawn to dusk. The Roman day organised itself around eating in patterns quite different from modern meal schedules. Understanding these rhythms reveals how Romans divided their time and what they considered important about different meals. The structure evolved considerably over Roman history, reflecting broader changes in society and economy. In the early Roman Republic, meals were simple and few. The main meal of the day, called cena, occurred in the late afternoon or early evening. Before this substantial meal, Romans might eat lightly once or twice during the day, but these earlier meals were minor affairs, barely worth noting. Life revolved around the single significant daily meal where families gathered and proper eating occurred. By the late Republic and into the imperial period, a more complex meal structure had emerged. The day typically began with ientaculum, a light breakfast taken shortly after waking. This was rarely a formal meal, more a quick bite to break the night's fast before beginning daily activities. For many Romans, particularly those of modest means, the ientaculum might consist of nothing more than bread dipped in wine or water, perhaps with some cheese or olives. Wealthy Romans might have a slightly more elaborate breakfast, adding honey to their bread, including some dried fruit, or even having a light porridge. But even among the elite, breakfast was not considered an important meal. It was functional, providing energy to start the day without demanding attention or ceremony. Around midday came prandium, the midday meal. Like breakfast, prandium was typically light and informal. Romans might eat cold leftovers from the previous day's cena, some bread and cheese, perhaps fish or vegetables. This was eaten quickly, often while standing or working, not a meal requiring special preparation or extended time. The timing of prandium varied with the season and individual schedules. Those engaged in physical labour might eat earlier to sustain their work. Those with leisure might eat later. There was no fixed hour, and many Romans, particularly those of the working classes, might skip prandium entirely if work demanded continuous attention, or if food was scarce. The important meal, the one Romans actually cared about, was cena. This occurred in the late afternoon or early evening, typically beginning around the 8th or 9th hour of daylight, which would be roughly 3 to 5 o'clock in modern time during most of the year. Roman hours varied with the season, dividing daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of the total length of day, so the precise timing shifted throughout the year. Cena was where Romans invested their time, attention, and resources. This was the meal where families gathered, where social life occurred, where proper dining rituals were observed. The duration of cena varied enormously depending on social context. A simple family meal might last an hour. An elaborate banquet could extend for many hours, sometimes continuing late into the night. For ordinary Romans, cena was a time to rest after the day's labour, to eat substantial food and to spend time with family. The meal might be simple, but it was taken seriously as the day's main sustenance and primary social time. The food was cooked fresh, unlike the cold leftovers of prandium, and eaten while hot when possible. Among the wealthy elite, cena became an elaborate social ritual. The meal was served in multiple courses, accompanied by entertainment and governed by complex rules of etiquette. Guests were carefully selected, seating arranged to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies, conversation directed by the host, and the quality and quantity of food deployed as statements of wealth and sophistication. These elaborate dinner parties, called convivia, were distinct from everyday family cena, though they shared the same name and occurred at the same time. A convivium was a performance, where the host demonstrated cultural refinement, political connections, and economic resources. Every detail mattered, from the food served to the entertainment provided to the wit of the conversation. The structure of an elaborate cena followed predictable patterns. The meal began with the gustatio, an appetizer course designed to stimulate appetite and set the tone for what followed. This might include eggs, shellfish, vegetables in vinegar, and other light foods accompanied by mulsum, wine sweetened with honey. The main courses, called mensae primae or first tables, followed. These featured the substantial dishes of the meal, multiple preparations of meat, fish and vegetables served simultaneously or in sequence. Romans didn't eat in the course-by-course progression familiar to modern formal dining, but rather had many dishes available at once, allowing diners to sample as they pleased. Finally came the dessert course called mensae secundae or second tables. This featured fruits, nuts, pastries and sweets. The terminology, second tables, derives from the practice of clearing away the main course dishes and replacing them with fresh serving dishes for the dessert items. Between the main courses and dessert came the commissatio, a drinking party that could last longer than the meal itself. During commissatio, serious drinking occurred, wine was consumed less diluted than during dinner, and entertainment became more prominent. This was when social bonds were reinforced through shared drinking, when political alliances were negotiated, when the boundaries between respectable dining and rowdy party became blurred. The timing of cena created a particular daily rhythm for Romans. Much of the day was free before the main meal, allowing for work, visits to the baths, exercise, or business. Afternoons were often devoted to bathing before dinner, an important social custom that prepared one physically and socially for the evening meal. The bath complex, or thermae, served as a social centre where Romans gathered before dispersing to their respective dinner engagements. After cena and its associated commissatio, Romans typically went to bed relatively soon. The Mediterranean climate, with darkness falling early in winter and late in summer, influenced when people slept. Without artificial lighting beyond expensive oil lamps and candles, most Romans retired not long after their evening meal concluded. This meal structure had practical implications for daily life. Since the only substantial meal came late in the day, Romans worked through much of the day on minimal food. This wouldn't have seemed unusual to them, as their bodies adapted to the pattern, but it does explain why prandium and other light meals were taken, providing just enough energy to continue until the evening meal. The meal timing also influenced work patterns. The hottest hours of the day, roughly noon to mid-afternoon, saw reduced activity as people rested or engaged in lighter activities. The bath culture fit naturally into this pattern, with baths serving as afternoon recreation before dinner. The entire social rhythm of Roman life pulsed around the late afternoon cena. Seasonal variations affected this timing considerably. In summer, with longer days and hotter temperatures, cena might be delayed to later hours when the air cooled. In winter, with short days and cold evenings, the meal might come earlier. The flexibility in Roman timekeeping, without the rigid clock-driven schedules of modern life, allowed for these natural adjustments. Social class influenced meal patterns significantly. Wealthy Romans with leisure could organise their days around elaborate meal rituals, spending hours in preparation, consumption, and post-meal conversation. Working Romans had less flexibility, eating quickly between work obligations, unable to linger over meals the way the elite could. For slaves, who formed a substantial portion of Rome's population, meal times were dictated entirely by their masters' schedules and convenience. Household slaves ate after serving their owners, often receiving leftover food. Agricultural slaves might eat simple field rations at whatever times work patterns allowed. The elaborate meal structures described in Roman sources applied primarily to free citizens, not to the enslaved population that sustained Roman society. Women's eating patterns varied by social class and marital status. In earlier Roman periods, women might eat separately from men, or eat before the formal cena, reflecting their subordinate social position. By the late Republic and Empire, elite women increasingly participated in formal dining, reclining alongside men at banquets in ways that earlier generations would have considered scandalous. Children's relationship to formal meals also evolved. Young children ate separately, taught that formal dining was an adult privilege. As they matured, they were gradually introduced to proper dining customs, learning the etiquette and behaviours expected at cena. This education in proper eating was considered essential training for adult life, particularly for boys who would need to navigate the social complexities of Roman dining culture. The elderly maintained dining patterns, but might eat lighter meals or skip the heaviest dishes, adjusting to changing physical capabilities. Roman respect for age meant that elderly diners received consideration at formal meals, given choice positions and appropriate foods. Sick Romans followed special diets prescribed by physicians according to medical theories of the time. Certain foods were considered appropriate for invalids, while others were forbidden. These dietary regimens could be quite elaborate, reflecting sophisticated medical thought about nutrition's role in health and recovery. Festivals and religious observances disrupted normal meal patterns, sometimes requiring fasting, other times mandating feasting. The Roman calendar was filled with festivals, and the associated eating requirements shaped annual rhythms alongside daily patterns. Some festivals required consumption of specific foods, while others prohibited certain items. The basic meal structure, breakfast light and forgettable, lunch quick and minimal, dinner substantial and social, persisted throughout Roman history despite the elaboration of elite dining practices. This pattern reflected practical realities of agricultural labour, Mediterranean climate, and limited food preservation technology. It also reflected Roman values that saw proper dining as an evening affair requiring time and attention that couldn't be spared during working hours. Understanding this daily rhythm is essential for comprehending Roman food culture. The concentration of eating in a single main meal, the social importance attached to that meal, the careful preparation and ritual surrounding it, all shaped how Romans thought about food and its place in life. Eating wasn't something that happened throughout the day but was concentrated into a specific time that became the focal point of daily social existence. This pattern also reveals Roman priorities. Work came first during the day, sustained by minimal food. Social life, family time, and the pleasures of eating came in the evening, after obligations were met. The structure reflected a society that valued hard work but also recognized the importance of rest, refreshment, and social connection at day's end. Roman society was intensely hierarchical, and nowhere was this hierarchy more visible than in what people ate and how they dined. Food served as both a marker and a reinforcer of social distinctions, creating an edible map of the Roman social order. Understanding who ate what, and under what circumstances, reveals the profound inequalities structuring Roman life. At the apex of Roman society stood the emperor and imperial family. Their dining reflected supreme power, with access to any food from anywhere in the empire. Imperial banquets featured ingredients transported from distant provinces at enormous expense, prepared by the finest cooks, served on precious tableware, and accompanied by elaborate entertainment. These meals weren't merely about eating, but about displaying the wealth and reach of Roman power. Historical accounts describe imperial feasts of staggering excess. The Emperor Vitellius, who ruled briefly in 69 CE, supposedly commissioned a dish called the Shield of Minerva, that required ingredients from across the empire: pike livers from Spain, pheasant and peacock brains from the east, flamingo tongues from Egypt, and lamprey guts from the Straits of Messina. Whether the specific details are accurate or exaggerated, the story reveals what contemporaries believed was possible for emperors. The Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 CE, gained a reputation for outrageous dining practices. Sources claim he served guests dishes made entirely from one colour, fed his dogs goose liver, and once smothered dinner guests with rose petals dropped from the ceiling, supposedly suffocating some unfortunate attendees. Again, These accounts likely contain exaggeration, but they reflect the extremes that imperial power made possible. Below the imperial family came the senatorial aristocracy, Rome's wealthiest and most politically powerful families. These families possessed enormous estates producing agricultural products, controlled international trade networks, and wielded influence that translated into access to the finest foods. Senatorial dining was elaborate but theoretically constrained by sumptuary laws, attempting to limit excessive display. These laws, passed periodically throughout Roman history, restricted spending on banquets, limited the number of guests, and prohibited certain extravagant foods. The laws were regularly ignored or circumvented, suggesting that the excess they tried to control was real enough to provoke legislative response even if enforcement proved difficult. Senatorial banquets served political purposes as much as nutritional ones. Invitations were carefully distributed to build alliances, reward supporters, and display power. The quality of food, the skill of entertainment, the wit of conversation, all contributed to a senator's reputation and political standing. A poorly executed dinner party could damage political prospects, while successful ones enhanced prestige. The equestrian order, Rome's business class, occupied the tier below senators. While often wealthy from trade and commerce, equestrians lacked the political prestige of senatorial families. Their dining reflected this position, elaborate enough to display wealth, but not quite matching senatorial extravagance. Equestrians might serve imported delicacies and fine wines, but perhaps fewer courses or less exotic ingredients than their social superiors. Below the elite orders came the plebs, the ordinary free citizens of Rome. This category contained enormous internal variation, from relatively prosperous merchants and craftsmen to poor labourers surviving on minimal resources. What unified the plebs was their exclusion from the political and social privileges of the higher orders, and this exclusion was reflected in their food. Prosperous plebeians ate adequately but simply compared to the elite. Their cena might feature good bread, vegetables, legumes, some fish or meat, and reasonable wine. They could afford olive oil for cooking and seasoning. Their meals were nutritious and satisfying without being elaborate or exotic. These Romans didn't starve, but neither did they dine on luxuries. Poor plebeians, including the urban masses of Rome itself, struggled more seriously with nutrition. Their diet centred on a grain distribution, the annona, provided by the state to Roman citizens. This grain, usually wheat, formed the foundation of their diet. They received enough to make bread or porridge that provided basic calories but little else. The annona reveals Roman society's approach to managing its urban population. Emperors understood that feeding Rome's masses was essential for political stability. The phrase bread and circuses, coined by the poet Juvenal, expressed the Roman strategy of keeping the people pacified through food distributions and public entertainment. Without the annona, urban Rome's poor would have faced starvation or rebellion. To supplement their grain ration, poor Romans scraped together what they could afford. Vegetables when available, dried legumes like lentils and beans, occasional cheap fish, and olive oil for cooking stretched their resources. Meat was rare, a luxury for festivals or special occasions. Their wine was the cheapest available, heavily watered and often sour. The poorest Romans, those without citizenship status or any resources, faced genuine food insecurity. They relied on whatever work they could find, public charity, private patron support, or simply went hungry. The urban landscape of Rome included many people living on the edge of starvation, making do with scraps and handouts. Freedmen, former slaves who had gained their freedom, occupied an ambiguous social position. Many freedmen prospered in business and accumulated substantial wealth, sometimes rivaling that of freeborn citizens. Yet social prejudice meant they couldn't fully participate in elite society regardless of their wealth. Their dining reflected this tension, sometimes ostentatious as they tried to demonstrate their success, sometimes criticised by freeborn elite as tasteless nouveau riche display. The character Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon exemplifies the stereotype of the freedman whose wealth couldn't purchase genuine refinement. Trimalchio's banquet features elaborate dishes and expensive ingredients, but is presented as grotesque rather than sophisticated, amusing rather than impressive. Whether fair or not, this literary portrait reveals elite attitudes toward freedmen's social pretensions. Slaves formed the foundation of Roman society and economy, perhaps 1/3 of the total population at the height of the empire. Their food situation varied enormously depending on their circumstances and their owners' practices. The variation was so extreme that generalizing about slave diet is difficult, yet some patterns emerge from the evidence. Household slaves in wealthy families might eat relatively well, receiving portions from their master's meals, or specially prepared slave rations. Urban domestic slaves probably had more reliable nutrition than many free poor, though their food remained simple and monotonous compared to what their masters enjoyed. Rural agricultural slaves faced harsher conditions. They received rations calculated to maintain work capacity but little more. These rations typically consisted of grain, olive oil, salt, and occasionally wine. Meat was rare. The quantity was sufficient to prevent starvation but not comfortable abundance. Mine slaves endured the worst conditions, working in terrible environments with minimal food. Their life expectancy was short, and their nutrition reflected the brutal calculation that replacing them was cheaper than feeding them well. This represented Roman slavery at its most callous. Human beings reduced to disposable labour. Some slaves received peculium, a form of allowance that allowed them to purchase additional food or save toward buying their freedom. These slaves might supplement their basic rations with market purchases, improving their diet marginally. But this privilege was far from universal, and depended entirely on their owner's generosity and the slave's opportunity to earn money. Soldiers represented another distinct category with their own food arrangements. The Roman army provided rations to its legionaries, ensuring that soldiers were adequately fed to maintain combat effectiveness. The military diet was monotonous but nutritious, centered on grain that soldiers processed themselves into bread or porridge, supplemented with bacon, cheese, sour wine called posca, and occasional vegetables. Soldiers could purchase additional foods from traders following the armies, or from local populations in areas where legions were stationed. Higher-ranking officers ate better than common soldiers, with access to more varied and higher-quality provisions. But even common legionaries ate more reliably than many civilians in the provinces. Provincial populations outside Italy experienced different food situations depending on local agriculture and their integration into Roman trade networks. Wealthy provincial elites adopted Roman dining customs, importing Italian wine and olive oil, building Roman-style triclinia, and imitating metropolitan fashions. They used food to assert their Romanization and their place within imperial hierarchy. Common provincial populations continued eating traditional foods, their diets shaped more by local agriculture and custom than by Roman influence. While Roman control might affect food production through taxation and trade, daily eating for most provincials probably changed little under Roman rule. They grew what they had always grown, cooked as they had always cooked, and maintained food traditions independent of Roman culture. This social pyramid of food was maintained through multiple mechanisms. Legal restrictions prevented lower orders from accessing certain privileges. Sumptuary laws, however imperfectly enforced, theoretically constrained excessive display by those below senatorial rank. Economic inequality ensured that expensive ingredients remained accessible only to the wealthy. Social customs reinforced food hierarchies as well. Elite diners cultivated refined tastes that distinguished them from the common masses. They developed sophisticated vocabularies around food and dining, creating cultural capital that money alone couldn't purchase. Knowing how to appreciate and discuss fine dining became a marker of elite status as important as actually consuming the food. The geography of dining physically separated social classes. Elite Romans dined in private homes in elegant triclinia, spaces designed specifically for formal reclining while eating. Ordinary Romans often ate in their small apartments or in public spaces like Thermopolia, the fast food establishments lining Roman streets. Slaves ate wherever their masters directed, often standing or in kitchen spaces. This spatial separation meant that different classes rarely witnessed each other's eating practices directly. Elite dining remained behind closed doors where only invited guests could observe. Common eating occurred in streets and public spaces but drew little elite attention. Each class ate in its own sphere, reinforcing the sense that different foods and different dining practices naturally belonged to different types of people. Gender added another layer to these hierarchies. Women's access to formal dining varied by class and era, but they generally occupied subordinate positions even within their own social classes. Elite women might attend banquets but face scrutiny and criticism that men didn't. Common women's eating was constrained by limited resources and domestic responsibilities. Female slaves had the least autonomy, their food situation entirely determined by their owners. Children were gradually socialized into appropriate food behaviors for their social class. Elite children learned elaborate dining etiquette, preparing to participate in the social world of formal banquets. Common children learned to appreciate simple food and not to expect luxuries beyond their station. Slave children grew up understanding that adequate food was a privilege their masters granted or withheld. The elderly maintained their social position's food patterns, but sometimes struggled as resources declined. Elderly elite might still host dinners, though less frequently. Elderly poor might face increasing food insecurity as their ability to work declined. The Roman system provided no social security, leaving the elderly dependent on family, patrons, or charity. This elaborate food hierarchy served important functions in Roman society. It made social distinctions visible and concrete. Everyone could see who ate what, who dined where, and who merited invitation to which gatherings. Food became a language for communicating social position, more immediate and accessible than abstract concepts of status or rank. The hierarchy also created aspiration and reinforced social mobility patterns. Those rising in wealth and status changed their eating accordingly, signalling their advancement through improved diet and dining practices. Those falling in status found their food options declining correspondingly. Social change was edible, tasted and digested along with the meals themselves. Yet the system also created resentment. The contrast between elite excess and common scarcity was stark enough to provoke criticism from moralists and anger from the poor. The emperor's maintenance of the annona recognized that food inequality, if too extreme, could destabilize society. Keeping the urban masses minimally fed was essential for preventing riots and maintaining order. The social pyramid of Roman food reveals a society comfortable with profound inequality, where what a person ate quite literally defined their place in the social order. From the emperor's exotic delicacies to the slave's daily grain ration, food reflected and reinforced the hierarchy structuring every aspect of Roman life. Beyond the famous banquets and exotic delicacies, most Romans ate far more simply, their diets shaped by agricultural realities, economic constraints, and practical cooking methods. Understanding the common Roman diet reveals daily life for the vast majority who never tasted dormouse or peacock, who never reclined in elaborate triclinia, who simply ate to survive and continue working. The foundation of ordinary Roman diet was grain, particularly wheat when available, sometimes barley for those who couldn't afford better. This grain was processed into two primary forms, bread and porridge. The distinction mattered significantly for social status, with bread representing a step up from porridge in the food hierarchy. Wheat porridge, called pulse, was ancient Rome's original staple food. In the early Republic, before bread making became common, most Romans ate pulse daily. The grain was boiled with water or milk into a thick, filling paste. Salt provided the only flavouring for the poorest, while those with more resources might add cheese, honey, or vegetables. Pulse was nutritious enough to sustain life, but monotonous and unexciting. As bread became more accessible, particularly in urban areas where professional bakers operated, porridge became associated with poverty and primitive simplicity. Moralists praised pulse as the simple food of virtuous ancestors, but few actual Romans chose porridge when bread was available. The transition from porridge to bread culture marked Rome's urban development and economic advancement. Roman bread varied considerably in quality. The finest bread, panis siligineus, made from the purest wheat flour, was expensive and associated with wealth. Common bread, panis plebeius, was coarser, darker, and made from less refined flour. The very poorest might eat bread made from barley or mixed grains, heavy and filling but less palatable than wheat bread. Bread was consumed at every meal and in enormous quantities. Romans used bread not just as food but as plates, with thick slices serving as edible trenchers that absorbed sauces and juices from other foods. These bread trenchers, soaked with flavourful liquids, were then eaten themselves. This practice made sense in a context where many Romans had minimal tableware. Professional bakeries operated throughout Rome and other major cities, producing bread for purchase. The remains of these bakeries, preserved at Pompeii and elsewhere, reveal the technology of Roman bread making. Large mills powered by donkeys grinding grain, kneading tables where dough was worked, and dome-shaped ovens where loaves were baked. The characteristic round Roman loaves, often scored into sections for easy breaking, have been found carbonized in Pompeian bakeries. For those too poor to purchase bread or lacking cooking facilities in crowded urban apartments, grain was received raw from the Annona distribution and taken to commercial mills and bakeries for processing, with fees paid for these services. This system ensured that even those without kitchens could convert their grain ration into edible bread. Vegetables formed another pillar of common Roman diet. The Romans cultivated numerous vegetable varieties, some familiar today, others less so. Cabbage held particular importance, eaten cooked or raw, and believed to have medicinal properties. Cato the Elder, writing in the 2nd century BCE, praised cabbage extensively in his agricultural manual, suggesting multiple preparation methods and claiming it cured various ailments. Onions and garlic were ubiquitous, providing flavour and considered healthful despite their strong odour. Leek served similar purposes. Lettuce, both cultivated varieties and wild greens, appeared regularly. Beets, both the roots and leaves, were eaten. Turnips provided filling, nutritious food, particularly important in winter when other vegetables were scarce. Legumes, particularly lentils, beans and chickpeas, provided crucial protein for Romans who consumed little meat. These foods were cheap, could be stored for extended periods, and when combined with grain provided reasonably complete nutrition. Lentil soup or stew was common fare, filling and nutritious if monotonous. Chickpeas were roasted as snacks or ground into flour for various preparations. Olive oil was essential to Roman cooking, providing fat for frying, flavouring for foods, and calories for those whose diets were otherwise lean. The Mediterranean climate was ideal for olive cultivation, and olive groves covered much of Italy and the provinces. Oil quality varied from expensive first-pressing oil used for finest cooking and as condiment to cheaper lower-grade oils used for cooking, lamps, and industrial purposes. For those who could afford it, fish provided important nutrition. The Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Tyrrhenian seas, along with numerous rivers, offered abundant fish. Small fish like anchovies and sardines were cheap enough for ordinary consumption, eaten fresh when possible or preserved through salting or pickling. These salted small fish were processed into garum, a fermented fish sauce that became one of Rome's most important condiments. Garum deserves special attention for its centrality to Roman cooking. This fermented fish sauce, made by allowing fish, usually small anchovies or mackerel, to decompose in salt under the sun, produced a liquid rich in umami flavour that Romans used the way contemporary cooks might use salt or soy sauce. Garum added depth and complexity to dishes, transforming simple vegetables or grains into more satisfying meals. The production and trade of garum was substantial industry, with famous production centres in Hispania and other coastal regions. Different grades existed, from luxurious garum sociorum that commanded high prices to cheaper varieties accessible to common people. Even poor Romans used some form of fish sauce, though the quality varied with their resources. Fresh fish, as opposed to salted or preserved fish, was more expensive but still accessible to Romans with modest means. Fish markets operated in Rome and other cities, supplied by fishing boats that worked the nearby waters. The variety was impressive. Mullet, sea bass, tuna, mackerel, and numerous other species appeared in Roman markets, depending on season and location. Meat was far less common in ordinary Roman diet than in modern Western diets. Most Romans ate meat rarely, perhaps on festivals, special occasions, or when they could afford small quantities. Pork was the most common meat, with Romans raising pigs that could be fed on scraps and foraged in woodlands. Pork was often preserved through salting or smoking, producing bacon and ham that could be stored. Poultry, particularly chicken, appeared more frequently than larger animals in common diets. Chickens were relatively easy to keep even in urban environments, produced eggs regularly, and could be slaughtered for meat when needed. Pigeons were also raised for food, with dovecotes providing both eggs and meat. Beef was rare for common Romans, as cattle were valuable for labour, and raising them for meat was economically inefficient. Goat and mutton appeared occasionally, but were not daily fare. The meat ordinary Romans ate was most often organ meats, sausages, or small portions used to flavour vegetable dishes, rather than served as the main component. Cheese provided another protein source and method of preserving milk. Romans made various cheeses from sheep, goat, and cow milk. Some were eaten fresh, soft, and mild. Others were aged until hard and sharp, capable of long storage. Cheese appeared at meals across social classes, though quality and quantity varied by wealth. Fresh milk was less common than cheese, as refrigeration didn't exist and milk spoiled quickly in the Mediterranean heat. What fresh milk was consumed came primarily from goats and sheep rather than cows. Milk was sometimes used in cooking, but wasn't drunk regularly by adults as it is in many modern cultures. Fruits provided sweetness and variety to Roman diet when in season. Figs were particularly important, growing easily in the Mediterranean climate and providing concentrated energy when dried. Grapes were eaten fresh and dried as raisins, in addition to being processed into wine. Apples, pears, and plums grew in appropriate regions. Dates imported from North Africa and the East provided exotic sweetness. Nuts, particularly almonds, walnuts, and chestnuts, appeared in Roman diets. Chestnuts were especially important in some regions, ground into flour as grain supplement or eaten roasted. Pine nuts featured in sauces and desserts. Nuts provided fat and protein valuable in diets light on meat. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar was unknown to Romans. Beekeeping was common, and honey appeared in numerous dishes, both savoury and sweet. The Romans were fond of mixing sweet and savoury flavours in ways modern palates might find unusual, with honey-sweetened sauces served on fish or meat. Herbs and spices seasoned Roman food significantly. Common herbs included coriander, cumin, oregano, thyme, mint, and bay leaves. Black pepper, imported from India at considerable expense, was prized by those who could afford it. Other imported spices like ginger and cinnamon appeared in wealthy kitchens but rarely in common cooking. Salt was essential and universally used. Rome's importance was historically linked to salt, with the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, being one of the ancient routes by which salt was transported from coastal salt pans to Rome. Salt preserved meat and fish, seasoned food, and was even used as payment in some contexts, the origin of the word salary. Vinegar served as important condiment and preservative. It was used in cooking, mixed with water, as a refreshing drink called posca, and used to pickle vegetables for preservation. The sour flavour was appreciated in Roman cuisine in ways that might seem excessive to modern tastes. The preparation of these common ingredients was relatively simple. Most cooking involved boiling, as the ceramic cookware and simple hearths available to ordinary Romans didn't facilitate the elaborate preparations described in elite cookbooks. Stews and porridges, one-pot meals where ingredients were combined and cooked together, were standard fare. Roasting occurred but required access to a proper oven or open fire space that many urban Romans lacked in their cramped apartments. Commercial bakeries sometimes allowed customers to use their ovens for roasting after the bread was done for a fee. Street vendors sold roasted meats and other prepared foods for those unable to cook at home. Frying in olive oil occurred but was expensive for those of modest means, as it required substantial quantities of oil. Most frying was probably shallow frying in minimal oil, rather than the deep frying that consumes large amounts. The monotony of the common diet was occasionally broken by festivals and celebrations. Religious festivals often involved communal sacrifices where meat was distributed to citizens. These occasions allowed ordinary Romans to taste meat and celebrate with more elaborate meals than their daily norm. Such festivals punctuated the year with anticipated culinary highlights. Private celebrations like birthdays, weddings, and coming-of-age ceremonies also provided occasions for better-than-usual food. Families saved resources to mark these important moments with special meals, even if modest by elite standards. The nutritional adequacy of this common diet was mixed. The grain-based diet provided sufficient calories for most Romans, though seasonal hunger remained a risk when harvest failed. Protein from legumes, fish, and occasional meat was probably adequate. The diet's high carbohydrate content and low meat consumption meant Romans were generally leaner than modern Westerners, though dietary deficiency diseases surely occurred. Vitamin deficiencies were possible, particularly in winter when fresh vegetables and fruits were scarce. Scurvy probably occurred, but may have been prevented by preserved foods like sauerkraut-like pickled vegetables. Anemia from iron deficiency might have affected some, particularly women of childbearing age, given the low meat consumption. The common Roman diet, while monotonous and simple by modern standards, was not necessarily unhealthy. The emphasis on whole grains, legumes, vegetables, olive oil and fish, with minimal processed foods and sugar, resembles what nutritionists today call the Mediterranean diet and consider quite healthful. Romans who ate this traditional diet, assuming adequate quantity, were probably reasonably nourished if not excited by their meals. What the common diet lacked was variety, excitement, and luxury. It was functional food that sustained life and work without providing the pleasures and social distinctions that elite dining offered. This divide between adequate common food and luxurious elite cuisine created a tension in Roman society between those who ate to live and those who lived, at least partially, to eat elaborately. Understanding what ordinary Romans actually ate, beyond the spectacular feasts that dominate historical accounts, reveals daily life's texture and the practical realities that shaped most people's experience. The foundation of Roman power wasn't exotic banquets, but the daily bread, porridge, vegetables and fish that fed the millions who built roads, served in legions, worked in workshops, and maintained the empire's fundamental functions. While common Romans ate simply to sustain themselves, the elite transformed dining into elaborate theatre, where wealth, sophistication, and power were displayed through extraordinary feasts. These banquets, preserved in Roman literature and historical accounts, reveal a world of culinary excess that both fascinated and troubled ancient observers. Understanding elite dining practices illuminates Roman values, anxieties, and the profound inequalities structuring society. The physical setting for elite dining was the triclinium, a room specifically designed for formal reclining while eating. The name derives from the three couches, clini, arranged in a U-shape around a central space where servants could circulate with food and entertainment could be staged. Each couch typically accommodated 3 diners, making 9 the ideal number for an intimate dinner party, though larger gatherings used multiple triclinia or additional couches. The couches themselves were substantial pieces of furniture, wooden frames with cushions and coverings that reflected the host's wealth. Diners reclined on their left sides, propped on cushions, leaving their right hands free to take food from shared platters. This reclining posture distinguished formal Roman dining from Greek symposia, where participants sat, and from the eating practices of lesser Romans who sat or stood while eating. The arrangement of diners on the couches followed strict hierarchical rules. The most prestigious position, the locus consularis, occupied the right end of the central couch, offering the best view of entertainment and easiest access to food. The host typically reclined in the least prestigious position, demonstrating humility while maintaining control over the proceedings. Guests were positioned according to their social status, with placement communicating subtle messages about favour, respect, and hierarchy. The meal itself unfolded in the 3-part structure mentioned earlier: gustatio, mensae primae, and mensae secundae. But within this framework, elite dinners showcased ingredients and preparations far beyond ordinary experience. The gustatio might feature oysters transported alive from Britain in special tanks of seawater, kept fresh for the journey across the empire. Exotic eggs from peafowl or rare birds demonstrated access to expensive novelties. Shellfish appeared extensively in elite dining. Beyond oysters, Romans prized sea urchins, mussels, clams, and various crustaceans. Wealthy Romans maintained fish ponds where they raised prized species, particularly mullet and lamprey eels. These ponds represented substantial investment and were status symbols as much as food sources. Stories circulated of fish ponds stocked with such valuable fish that selling them would equal the value of the estate itself. The main courses at elite banquets featured an astonishing variety. Multiple preparations of meat and fish appeared simultaneously: roasted, boiled, fried, in pastries, in sauces. The famous cookbook attributed to Apicius, a wealthy Roman gourmet of the 1st century CE, preserves recipes revealing the complexity of elite cooking. Sauces combined numerous ingredients, sweet and savoury flavours mixed freely, and presentation emphasised visual appeal as much as taste. Exotic meats appeared to demonstrate access and sophistication. Peacock, prized more for appearance than flavour, was served with its colourful plumage reattached after roasting to create visual spectacle. Flamingo tongues, incredibly expensive due to the number of birds required to produce a single dish, represented extreme luxury. Ostrich, imported from Africa, offered exotic novelty. Wild boar, hunted on private estates, connected diners to aristocratic leisure pursuits. The Romans were fond of deceptive dishes that appeared to be one thing but revealed themselves as another. A roast pig might actually be smaller birds sewn inside a pig's hide. Pastries shaped like fruits might contain savoury meat fillings. These culinary jokes entertained guests and demonstrated the cook's technical skill. The goal was surprise and delight, creating memorable dining experiences that guests would discuss for years. Elaborate presentations transformed food into art. The Trojan pig, described in the Satyricon, consisted of a roasted pig whose belly, when carved, released live thrushes that flew around the dining room. Whether such extreme presentations actually occurred or represent literary exaggeration, they indicate the theatrical possibilities elite hosts pursued. Food was spectacle, not merely sustenance. Dormice, specifically raised in special containers called gliraria, appeared at elite tables as delicacies. These small rodents were fattened on chestnuts and acorns, then cooked and served as appetizers. While the thought might disgust modern palates, Romans considered them choice morsels. The practice represented the Roman willingness to eat animals that other cultures might reject, seeking novelty and demonstrating sophisticated palates unbound by common prejudices. The quantities served at elite banquets were deliberately excessive. Multiple whole animals might be prepared for relatively few diners. The expectation was that much food would remain uneaten, to be distributed to servants and clients, or, in cases of ostentatious waste, simply discarded. Abundance beyond necessity demonstrated wealth and generosity, while ensuring that no guest could possibly leave hungry. Entertainment accompanied elite dining as an essential element. Musicians played during meals, typically slaves trained in Greek instruments like the lyre or flute. The music set atmosphere and provided pleasant background, but wasn't intended to dominate attention. Conversation remained primary entertainment, with cultured discussion of literature, philosophy, and current events expected from educated guests. More elaborate entertainment might include dances, acrobats, or recitations of poetry. Some hosts hired professional entertainers called parasiti, skilled conversationalists who amused guests with witty remarks and anecdotes in exchange for the meal itself. These parasites, while often mocked in literature, served the function of ensuring lively dinner conversation and preventing awkward silences. The most elaborate banquets featured theatrical performances, with actors presenting scenes from comedies or tragedies. Some wealthy hosts commissioned original works performed at their dinners. These performances reflected Greek cultural influence and demonstrated the host's patronage of the arts. Guests were expected to appreciate the literary references and respond with cultivated commentary. The drinking that followed dinner, the commissatio, was governed by its own elaborate customs. A master of ceremonies, called the magister bibendi or arbiter bibendi, was appointed to determine the strength of the wine mixture and establish drinking games or conversation topics. This position rotated among guests or was given as honour to a particular individual. Romans almost never drank unmixed wine, considering it barbaric to consume wine at full strength. Instead, wine was mixed with water in varying proportions depending on the occasion and the stage of the evening. Early in the meal, wine might be mixed 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. During the commissatio, the proportion might shift towards stronger mixtures, though still diluted from pure wine. The quality of wine served demonstrated the host's resources and taste. The finest wines came from specific regions, particularly Campania, and from particular vintages. Connoisseurs discussed wine with the same sophisticated vocabulary later wine cultures would develop, debating the characteristics of different vintages and regions. The oldest wines, sometimes decades old, commanded premium prices and were reserved for the most important occasions and distinguished guests. Toasting occurred throughout the drinking portion of the evening. Diners might toast the emperor, absent friends, successful business ventures, or romantic interests. The formula "to your health" accompanied these toasts, with the belief that drinking to someone's health magically contributed to their well-being. Superstition and ritual permeated even the seemingly simple act of drinking. The duration of these elaborate banquets could extend far into the night. a dinner beginning in late afternoon might continue past midnight, with the conversatio lasting longer than the meal itself. For hosts and guests with no obligations the following day, the evening could blur into the small hours, sustained by wine, conversation, and the pleasure of extended leisure. The morning after particularly excessive banquets must have been unpleasant. While Romans recognised hangovers and their causes, this didn't prevent heavy drinking at appropriate social occasions. Medical writers offered advice for treating excessive indulgence, particular foods, herbs, or continued drinking to ease symptoms. The concept of hair of the dog has ancient precedents in Roman practice. Vomiting during or after banquets appears in Roman sources, leading to the persistent but likely exaggerated claim that Romans routinely vomited mid-feast to make room for more food. The vomitorium, often cited as proof of this practice, was actually an architectural term for the passages in amphitheatres through which crowds exited, not a special vomiting room. While some Romans certainly overindulged to the point of illness, the image of systematic vomiting as standard banquet practice is probably more literary stereotype than historical reality. The cost of these elite banquets was staggering. Historians recorded specific examples where single dinners consumed amounts equivalent to annual incomes for common Romans. Pliny the Elder mentioned banquets costing hundreds of thousands of sesterces, when a legionary soldier earned about 900 sesterces annually. The economic irrationality of such expenditure troubled Roman moralists, who saw in it evidence of moral decline and unsustainable luxury. Sumptuary legislation attempting to control banquet excess appeared repeatedly throughout Roman history, suggesting that the problem was real and concerning to authorities. The Lex Fania of 161 BCE limited spending on dinners and specified maximum numbers of guests. The Lex Didia of 143 BCE extended these restrictions. Later laws under various emperors attempted similar controls, always with limited success. The persistent failure of sumptuary legislation reveals the social importance of lavish entertaining. For elite Romans, hosting memorable dinners was essential to maintaining status, building political alliances, and demonstrating cultural sophistication. No amount of legal restriction could overcome the social pressure to entertain lavishly. Those who economized on hospitality risked being labelled stingy and losing influence. The moral discourse surrounding banquets divided Romans between those who celebrated refined dining as legitimate pleasure and cultural achievement, and those who condemned it as decadent excess undermining traditional virtue. Philosophers debated whether elaborate meals represented appropriate use of wealth or dangerous corruption. The Stoics generally criticized luxury, advocating simple living regardless of resources. Epicureans, despite their association with pleasure, actually advocated moderation and argued that simple food provided pleasure equal to elaborate fare when hunger was genuine. Political opponents used accusations of banquet excess as weapons. Describing an enemy as gluttonous or excessively fond of luxury served to undermine their moral authority and fitness for leadership. The dining habits of emperors became subject to intense scrutiny, with elaborate entertaining sometimes accepted as appropriate imperial magnificence, other times criticised as tyrannical waste. The tension between public and private dining added another dimension. What a Roman ate privately in his own home was theoretically his business, but because elite dining was inherently social, occurring in the presence of guests whose discretion couldn't be guaranteed, banquet practices inevitably became public knowledge. The dining room was a semi-public space where reputation was made and lost, based on the quality of food, entertainment, and conversation. Women's participation in elite banquets evolved considerably over Roman history. In the early Republic, respectable women typically didn't recline at banquets with men, either dining separately or sitting while men reclined. By the late Republic and Empire, elite women increasingly participated in mixed gender dining, reclining alongside male guests. This represented a significant social change that conservative critics saw as evidence of moral decline. The presence of women at banquets created new social dynamics and potential scandalers. Mixed-gender dining raised questions about propriety, particularly when substantial drinking occurred. Literary sources preserve accounts of dinners where behaviour crossed acceptable boundaries, with romantic intrigue developing and reputations damaged. Whether these accounts reflect common reality or sensationalised exception remains debatable, but they reveal anxieties surrounding the social mixing that banquets enabled. Children's relationship to elite dining was carefully managed. Young children were excluded entirely, considered too uncivilized for formal occasions. As boys reached adolescence, they might be allowed to attend dinners as part of their education in proper behaviour, though they occupied inferior positions and were expected to listen rather than speak unless addressed. Girls generally remained excluded longer, only participating in formal dining after marriage. The education of elite youth included specific training in banquet etiquette and conversation. Young Romans learned proper reclining posture, how to take food gracefully from shared plates, how to drink without appearing greedy or clumsy, and above all, how to converse wittily and appropriately. These skills were considered essential for adult social success, particularly for those with political ambitions. Servants worked invisibly throughout elite banquets, trained to anticipate needs and fulfill them without drawing attention. The number of servants attending a banquet reflected the host's wealth, with dozens of slaves required for truly elaborate dinners. These servants had specialized roles. Some carried dishes, others poured wine, still others attended to individual guests' needs. The well-trained servant was silent, efficient, and nearly invisible, allowing guests to focus on each other and the food. The physical labour required to produce these banquets was extraordinary. In kitchens hidden from guests, slave cooks worked over hot fires in often cramped conditions. They had to time multiple dishes to be ready simultaneously, create the elaborate presentations hosts demanded, and maintain quality despite the quantities involved. The head cook, often a highly skilled and valuable slave, wielded considerable authority in the kitchen despite his enslaved status. Shopping for an elite banquet required extensive knowledge and resources. Stewards ventured to markets to select ingredients, bargaining with sellers for best quality and prices. Some ingredients had to be ordered in advance, particularly if they required import from distant regions. The logistics of assembling ingredients from across the empire for a single dinner party demonstrated both Roman organisational capability and the vast trade networks the empire sustained. Elite dining thus represented far more than eating. It was performance, social ritual, political tool, cultural statement, and display of power. The elaborate banquets that have fascinated observers for millennia were carefully orchestrated events where every detail communicated meaning. Understanding these dinners reveals elite Roman life's complexity and the sophisticated social codes governing high-status interaction. Yet these banquets, however culturally significant, remained accessible to only a tiny fraction of Roman society. The vast majority of Romans never attended such dinners, never tasted the exotic food served, never reclined on cushioned couches while servants attended their every need. The elite dining world was a separate realm, connected to common experience only through the servants who made it possible, and the cultural commentary it generated. Behind every Roman meal, whether simple or elaborate, lay practical cooking processes shaped by available technology, fuel constraints, and the physical spaces where food preparation occurred. Understanding Roman kitchens and cooking methods reveals the material realities supporting food culture, and the impressive sophistication Romans achieved within technological limitations. Roman kitchens varied enormously by social class and location. In wealthy urban homes, dedicated kitchen spaces called culine occupied ground floor rooms, typically located away from living areas to isolate heat, smoke, and cooking odours. These kitchens featured built-in hearths where fires burned for cooking, raised brick or stone platforms for preparing ingredients, and storage areas for cooking equipment and supplies. The hearth, called a focus, formed the kitchen centre. Unlike modern stoves with multiple burners, Roman hearths were essentially small fireplaces where wood or charcoal burned on a raised brick or stone platform. Pots and pans were supported over the fire by metal tripods, or were placed directly on the coals. The heat was difficult to control with precision, requiring considerable skill to manage effectively. Charcoal was the preferred fuel for cooking, burning hotter and cleaner than wood while producing less smoke. However, charcoal was more expensive than wood, so its use depended on resources available. Wealthy households burned charcoal liberally, while poorer Romans used whatever fuel they could afford or scavenge. The choice of fuel affected not just cooking ease, but also food flavour, with smoke from different woods imparting different tastes. Kitchen equipment consisted primarily of ceramic cookware, bronze vessels, and iron tools. Large ceramic pots and jars stored water, wine, oil, and other liquids. Smaller ceramic vessels were used for cooking and serving. Bronze pots, more expensive and durable than ceramic, appeared in wealthier kitchens. Specialised vessels existed for specific purposes: deep pots for boiling, shallow pans for frying, and various sizes of mixing bowls. The Romans used utensils recognisable today: knives for cutting, spoons for stirring and serving, ladles for transferring liquids. Forks, however, were absent from Roman kitchens, as Romans ate primarily with their hands and spoons. The lack of forks meant that food had to be prepared in pieces manageable for hand-eating, influencing presentation styles and cutting techniques. Mortars and pestles, called mortaria, were essential kitchen tools used for grinding spices, crushing herbs, and mixing sauces. Large mortaria, some substantial enough to require significant strength to use, ground grains into flour or processed tough ingredients. Smaller versions handled herbs and spices. The porous surface of the ceramic mortarium provided excellent grinding action, and Romans used these tools extensively. Strainers and sieves separated solids from liquids, refined flour, or created smooth sauces. These came in various sizes and materials depending on their purpose. Graters shredded cheese and hard vegetables. Whisks, usually made from bound twigs or reeds, incorporated air into mixtures. The basic toolkit of a Roman kitchen would be recognisable to modern cooks, though lacking the convenience of modern materials and manufacturing. Storage presented constant challenges in a pre-refrigeration world. Perishable foods had to be used quickly, or preserved through drying, salting, pickling, or fermentation. Wealthy Romans had cool storage areas, cellars dug into the ground where the earth's insulation kept temperatures lower than ambient air. Wine, oil, and preserved foods were stored in these cellars in large ceramic vessels called dolia, or amphorae. Amphorae, the iconic two-handled clay vessels with pointed bottoms, served as primary shipping and storage containers throughout the Roman world. They were designed to be stacked in ships' holds or embedded upright in sand or earth for stable storage. Different amphora shapes indicated different contents and origins, allowing archaeologists to trace ancient trade routes by studying amphora sherds found at various sites. Food preservation techniques were crucial for maintaining food supply through seasons when fresh food was unavailable. Salting preserved meats and fish, with varying levels of salt creating different products from lightly cured to heavily salted and dried. Smoking preserved meats while adding flavour. Honey preserved fruits and other foods, with the high sugar content preventing bacterial growth. Pickling in vinegar preserved vegetables and some meats, creating tangy preserved foods that added variety to winter diets. Fermentation preserved and transformed ingredients, producing garum, wine, and various pickled preparations. These preservation techniques, developed over centuries of experimentation, allowed Romans to eat relatively varied diets year-round despite the limitations of seasonal agriculture. Cooking techniques employed by Romans covered the standard methods still used today: boiling, roasting, frying, and baking. Boiling was probably most common for everyday cooking, as it required minimal attention once the pot was on the fire and could accommodate one-pot meals that fed families efficiently. Stews and porridges boiled slowly, developing flavours and tenderising tough ingredients. Roasting required more specific equipment and attention. In wealthy households, meat might be roasted on spits turned by kitchen slaves, ensuring even cooking. Some kitchens had built-in brick ovens where bread was baked and meats roasted. The intense heat of a properly fired oven created the crispy exterior and moist interior that made roasted foods desirable. Frying occurred, but was less common than boiling or roasting, particularly among those of modest means, due to the quantities of expensive olive oil required. When frying did occur, it used shallow oil rather than deep frying, with foods cooked in minimal fat rather than submerged completely. This economized on oil while still producing the desired browned, crisp results. Baking was often outsourced to professional bakers who had the large ovens and expertise required. Home cooks might prepare dough, but then take it to a commercial bakery for baking, paying for oven use. This system made sense in urban areas where many homes lacked suitable baking facilities, and where economies of scale made commercial baking efficient. The timing and coordination required for elaborate meals demanded significant skill. For banquets with multiple courses and numerous dishes, kitchen staff had to orchestrate preparation, so that hot foods arrived hot and cold foods cold, that dishes flowed in proper sequence, and that nothing was overcooked or undercooked. Without modern timing devices or temperature controls, this required experience, judgment, and careful attention. Recipes from Apicius's cookbook reveal sophisticated cooking techniques, reduction of sauces to concentrate flavours, binding agents like eggs to thicken liquids, the use of specific ingredients to achieve desired textures and tastes. The recipes assume considerable cooking knowledge, as they typically provide lists of ingredients and general procedures but little detail about quantities, timing, or technique specifics. They were written for experienced cooks, not beginners. The layering of flavours in Roman cooking differed considerably from modern Western approaches. Romans loved complex sauces combining sweet, sour, salty, and savoury elements. Honey might be mixed with vinegar and garum to create a sauce that was simultaneously sweet, sour, and umami-rich. Fresh herbs, dried spices, and fermented products combined in ways that created complex flavour profiles, quite unlike contemporary tastes. The love of intense flavours, particularly the extensive use of garum, meant that Roman food probably tasted stronger and more pungent than most modern dishes. The fermented fish flavour that garum contributed would be immediately noticeable to contemporary palates, though Romans were so accustomed to it that they may not have consciously registered it as distinctive. Like fish sauce in Southeast Asian cooking, garum was ubiquitous enough to be taken for granted. Colour in food mattered to Romans, who appreciated visual appeal as much as taste. Saffron added golden colour to dishes and was used generously by those who could afford it. Other ingredients were chosen partly for their contribution to visual appearance. The elaborate presentations at elite banquets emphasised that food should delight the eyes as well as the palate. Temperature control in Roman cooking was imprecise by modern standards. Without thermometers or adjustable burners, cooks judged heat by hand proximity to the fire and by observing how foods cooked. This required skill developed through long experience. A master cook knew by sight, sound, and smell when foods were properly cooked, adjusting fire heat by adding or removing fuel. Smoke management was a constant challenge. While Roman kitchens had openings in roofs or walls to vent smoke, the process was imperfect. Cooks worked in smoky environments that were uncomfortable and probably unhealthy. The smoke also flavoured food, giving many dishes a smoky undertone that Romans simply accepted as normal. Modern reconstructions of Roman cooking note that the smoke flavour is noticeable even when not intended. Water for cooking and cleaning had to be carried into kitchens, as piped water was rare even in wealthy homes and non-existent in most. Slaves or servants spent considerable time hauling water from wells, fountains, or in Rome itself, from the aqueduct-fed public fountains. The physical labour involved in simply having water available for cooking was substantial and invisible to those who benefited from the finished meals. Cleaning up after cooking required more labour. Without running hot water, washing pots, pans and utensils meant heating water, scrubbing with abrasive materials like sand or ash, and rinsing with clean water. In wealthy households, specialised slaves handled these tasks. In poorer households, family members, usually women and girls, did the work themselves. In cramped urban apartments, the insular buildings where many Romans lived, cooking facilities were minimal or non-existent. Fire risk in these densely packed wooden structures meant that landlords often prohibited cooking fires entirely. Residents without cooking facilities purchased prepared food from taverns and street vendors, maintained cold pantries with bread and cheese, or had extremely limited options for hot meals. This lack of domestic cooking facilities meant that much urban food consumption occurred outside the home, in commercial establishments. The thermopolia, taverns with built-in serving counters where hot food was kept in large vessels embedded in masonry counters, provided ready-made meals to those without kitchens. These establishments were common throughout Roman cities, serving an essential function in feeding populations unable to cook for themselves. The preserved remains of thermopolia at Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal their structure. The L-shaped counters with large ceramic vessels sunk into them created service areas where customers could order food and drink. Behind the serving areas were preparation spaces with hearths for cooking. Some thermopolia had seating areas where customers could consume their purchases, while others operated as takeaway services. The food sold at thermopolia was simple but satisfying. Stews, porridges, bread, wine, and various prepared dishes. the quality varied with the establishment, from relatively respectable taverns serving decent food to more questionable operations of dubious hygiene. Literary sources often portrayed Thermopolia as disreputable places frequented by the lower classes, though archaeological evidence suggests they served a much broader clientele. Rural cooking arrangements differed from urban kitchens. Farm households cooked in spaces that were often part of larger multi-purpose rooms, rather than dedicated kitchens. Hearths served for both cooking and heating. The ingredients available were primarily what the household produced itself, with market purchases limited to what couldn't be grown or made on the farm. Seasonal variations affected cooking dramatically. In winter, fresh vegetables were scarce, and cooking relied heavily on preserved foods and stored grains. The hearth's warmth was welcome, and slow-cooked dishes made sense both for tenderness and for heating living spaces. Summer's abundance brought fresh produce, but cooking over hot fires in already warm weather made the kitchen space uncomfortable. Some summer cooking might move outdoors when possible. Wealthy Romans employed professional cooks, often highly trained slaves who commanded high prices due to their skills. These cooks had learned elaborate preparation techniques, could manage the complex logistics of multi-course banquets, and possessed the creativity to develop new dishes that would impress guests. Some cooks gained such reputations that they became celebrities in their own right, discussed and sought after by elite hosts. The training of cooks involved years of apprenticeship, learning techniques through observation and practice. Young slaves assigned to kitchen work started with menial tasks and gradually took on more complex responsibilities as they demonstrated competence. The most talented might eventually become head cooks, overseeing entire kitchen staffs and planning elaborate menus. The hierarchical structure of elite kitchen staffs resembled military organization. The head cook commanded, delegating specific tasks to subordinate cooks and kitchen slaves. Some slaves specialized in particular types of preparation. One might focus on pastries, another on sauces, yet another on meat preparation. This specialization allowed for the efficiency required to produce elaborate banquets. Kitchen gardens, horti, provided fresh herbs and some vegetables for cooking. Even urban homes might maintain small gardens or potted plants, providing essential flavoring ingredients. These gardens represented valuable resources, allowing cooks access to fresh herbs that enhanced even simple dishes. The connection between garden and kitchen was direct and immediate. The relationship between food preparation and medicine was closer in Roman thinking than in modern Western culture. Many foods were believed to have medicinal properties, and many medicines involved food ingredients. Cooks needed to understand not just flavour, but also the supposed health effects of different ingredients and preparations. Certain foods were considered heating or cooling, moistening or drying, affecting the body's humoral balance. This medical dimension of cooking meant that elite cooks had to consider not just taste, but also the supposed health implications of dishes served to particular guests. Foods appropriate for robust young men might be considered unsuitable for the elderly or infirm. Banquet planning involved these medical considerations alongside aesthetic and social factors. Roman cooking, despite its technological limitations, achieved remarkable sophistication. The dishes produced in Roman kitchens range from simple but nourishing meals sustaining working families to elaborate creations that impress sophisticated diners accustomed to luxury. The techniques developed over centuries, the accumulated wisdom about ingredients and their preparation, and the skilled labour of cooks and kitchen workers created a culinary culture whose complexity and achievement deserves recognition. As the Mediterranean sun sets on the ancient world, casting long shadows across ruins where Romans once dined, reflection on Roman food culture reveals a civilization whose relationship with eating was simultaneously familiar and alien to modern understanding. The Romans shared with contemporary society an interest in food that went beyond mere survival, transforming eating into social ritual, cultural expression, and arena for displaying identity and values. Yet the specific forms this interest took, the particular dishes consumed, the social structures surrounding dining, and the meanings attached to food, all these differed considerably from contemporary Western food culture. Understanding these similarities and differences illuminates both Roman society and our own, revealing how food serves as a window into civilization's deepest values and structures. The profound inequality characterizing Roman food culture stands out starkly to modern sensibilities. The contrast between elite excess and common scarcity was accepted as natural by most Romans, who saw social hierarchy as inevitable and proper. While modern societies also exhibit food inequality, the extremes were greater in Rome and less questioned by those who benefited. This acceptance of inequality reflected broader Roman values that emphasized status differences and hierarchical social organization. Food was one of many areas where hierarchy manifested, alongside clothing, housing, political rights, and legal status. The visibility of food inequality made abstract social structures concrete and immediate, edible and digestible. The social dimensions of Roman dining, the careful orchestration of guest lists, seating arrangements, and menu selections to communicate status and reinforce hierarchies, might seem excessive to contemporary diners accustomed to more casual approaches. Yet modern formal dining retains echoes of these concerns, suggesting that the human tendency to use food as social communication transcends particular cultural contexts. The elaborate banquets that have fascinated observers for millennia represent extreme examples of this social use of food, but the underlying dynamic, using dining to build relationships, display resources, and compete for status, remains recognizable. Contemporary dinner parties, however different in detail, serve similar functions of creating and maintaining social bonds. Roman approaches to flavour, particularly the love of intensely flavoured foods and complex sauces, mixing sweet, sour and savoury elements, might initially seem strange to modern Western palates trained on different flavour profiles. Yet similarities to Asian cuisines that mix comparable flavours suggest that Roman tastes weren't aberrant, but rather reflected one among many possible approaches to creating satisfying foods. The practical constraints shaping Roman cooking, the lack of refrigeration, the limited range of cooking equipment, the challenges of fire management, remind contemporary cooks how much modern convenience rests on recent technological developments. Roman cooks achieved remarkable results within significant limitations, developing techniques and traditions that worked within their constraints. The wine culture that permeated Roman life reveals a society where alcohol was ubiquitous, but not necessarily consumed to excess, where social drinking served functions beyond mere intoxication, and where the pleasures of wine were celebrated within frameworks of moderation. This balanced approach contrasts with both the excessive drinking sometimes associated with contemporary party culture and the complete abstinence advocated by some modern movements. The religious dimensions of Roman eating, the libations and sacrifices, the festivals centered on food, the belief that diet affected not just physical but spiritual health, all these remind contemporary secular societies that for most of human history, eating has been understood as having sacred dimensions. The modern separation of eating from religious observance represents a relatively recent development, not the natural state of affairs. The gender dynamics of Roman dining, particularly the evolution from excluding women from formal meals to including them, reveals how food customs both reflect and shape broader social values. The controversies surrounding women's participation in banquets connected to larger debates about women's proper role in society, with dining serving as contested ground where these issues played out. The Roman solution to urban food provision, combining grain distributions, commercial bakeries, street food vendors, and taverns, addressed the challenge of feeding dense urban populations without home cooking facilities. Modern cities face similar challenges, and while solutions differ in detail, the underlying problem of feeding urban masses who cannot all cook for themselves remains. The environmental implications of Roman food culture, particularly the demand for exotic ingredients requiring long-distance transport, anticipate contemporary concerns about food miles and sustainability. The Roman willingness to transport foods thousands of miles for elite consumption prioritized luxury over efficiency, a choice that contemporary environmental awareness might question. The labour exploitation underlying Roman food culture, the enslaved cooks and servers, the helots and serfs working fields, the general acceptance that some humans existed to serve others' culinary pleasures, represents the darkest aspect of Roman dining. Modern ethical concerns about labour exploitation in food production suggest continuing relevance of these issues, though specific forms have evolved. The moral discourse surrounding food in Roman society, the debates between those celebrating culinary luxury and those condemning it as corruption, parallels modern discussions about food ethics, contemporary debates about local versus imported foods, sustainable versus conventional agriculture, luxury versus simplicity, echo Roman concerns about what food choices reveal about character and values. The written legacy Romans left about food, particularly Apicius's cookbook and numerous literary references to dining, has preserved knowledge about ancient cuisine that allows modern understanding and even recreation of Roman dishes. This textual legacy, combined with archaeological evidence of kitchens, markets, and stored foods, provides unusually rich documentation of ancient foodways. Modern attempts to recreate Roman dishes using ancient recipes reveal both similarities to and differences from contemporary foods. Some Roman flavours translate readily to modern palates, while others seem strange or unpalatable. These experiments in archaeological cooking illuminate both Roman tastes and contemporary preferences, revealing how culturally constructed food preferences actually are. The influence of Roman food culture on later European cuisines is difficult to trace precisely, but certainly existed. Some continuities in Mediterranean cooking may descend directly from Roman traditions. Other practices were lost and later reinvented. The olive oil and wine culture that characterises Mediterranean cuisine today has ancient roots predating Rome, but was certainly shaped by Roman practices. The fascination Roman food culture continues to exert on contemporary imagination reveals something about modern concerns and interests. The elaborate banquets appeal to fantasies of luxury and excess. The democratic accessibility of Roman street food suggests more egalitarian aspects of ancient life. The exotic ingredients and unexpected flavour combinations provide novelty and surprise. Roman food culture serves as both mirror reflecting contemporary concerns and window opening onto genuinely different worldview. In the end, Roman eating culture reveals a civilization that took food seriously, that understood its power to communicate meaning, create social bonds, and provide pleasure beyond mere nutrition. The specific forms Roman food culture took, the dishes consumed, the customs practiced, the values expressed, were products of their particular time and place. Yet the underlying insight that eating matters beyond its biological necessity, that food culture reveals and shapes societies, remains universally relevant. The journey through Roman food culture, from common grain porridge to elaborate banquets, from simple tavern meals to theatrical feasts, from everyday wine to prestigious vintages, illuminates a complex civilization whose relationship with food was rich, sophisticated, and deeply meaningful. The Romans ate to live, certainly, but they also lived to eat, at least those privileged enough to have that luxury, and in doing so created a food culture whose legacy and lessons continue resonating across millennia. As darkness fully falls on the ancient world, and the last Roman banquet concludes in the mists of history, the lessons remain. Food is never merely food, eating is never just nutrition, and the table, whether wooden board in a humble home or elegant triclinium in a villa, is always a place where human beings express who they are, what they value, and how they understand their place in the world. The Romans understood this deeply, and their food culture, for all its strangeness and distance, speaks across centuries to contemporary diners seeking meaning in their own meals.